E-commerce has been the dominant force in retail over the last few years. In the UK, online sales grew 45% year over year in 2020, and now almost 1 in 3 retail sales are made online. I'm Christos, I'm the General Manager of Flexport for the UK. I have the privilege of being joined today by Kieran Donovan for a discussion on the impact that e-commerce has had on supply chains. I want to first introduce Kieran for the audience. He's the Director of Supply Chain at Heroes. Heroes is a company that owns and operates brands that sell predominantly on Amazon marketplaces in Europe and in the US. You can buy through Heroes brands on Amazon everything from massagers to garden shears. He has more than 20 years experience in supply chain and logistics, including heading up supply chain at The White Company and Mountain Warehouse, which are very prominent UK high street brick and mortar retailers. So Kieran, you're obviously a very busy man. Thank you for taking the time to join me today, and welcome to Forward 2021. So let's start by talking about Heroes. This is an e-commerce business with a very interesting model. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the company does?
Yeah, sure. I think you touched on it a bit in the intro. So we own a stable of brands selling a multitude of different products. I think what's really interesting about the model is that we are buying what's called a private label seller. So this is an individual or a couple or a small business, or in one fantastic case, a grandmother and her grandson who've set up a business on Amazon themselves. And we basically come along and acquire the brands. So we acquire brands that have got good reviews, good rankings, are doing good sales, and we then aggregate those together. And as part of that, we're then bringing all of our expertise across a whole load of functions to bear to be able to really turbocharge the growth of those brands on the marketplaces that they sell in.
Got it. And I would imagine that one of the things that, when you talk about turbocharging those brands, one of the things that you probably add a lot of value in is their supply chain setup, right? And their supply chain operations. When you acquire these brands, where do you typically add value to the supply chain? What do you kind of change about what they're doing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So you're absolutely right. Supply chain is one of the real points of differentiation that we can bring. My big focus is really around driving product availability. And that comes from a couple of things. One, we have a stronger balance sheet typically than a private label business. So we're able to better invest in stock. But that isn't just a blanket, let's go out and buy much more product. We really focus on using tools that give us visibility and partners that give us visibility to make sure that we plan the stock better, have clear understanding of what's going on in the supply chain, and make sure that we get products to market in a timely manner. So we just put a much more structured process around it from demand forecasting onwards. And then leverage our scale and the partners that we have to be able to run things in a much more efficient and much more cost-effective manner, typically.
Yes. And across that kind of spectrum, where do you find you typically add the most value to the way they think about their supply chain? Is it in the way that they are forecasting and planning? Is it the fundamental holding of stock? Is it the where they're buying from? Like what do you typically find yourself changing in that model?
Yeah, I think it's the forecasting and planning. I think that's where we really add a lot of differentiation. We are able to typically, and that's not all brand owners, some are very savvy around this, but typically that's one area where we see being able to plan sales more effectively, structure our inventory better, and therefore make sure we're buying in a much more efficient manner is typically where that benefit comes from. So moving to a monthly cycle of purchase order raising and purchase shipment for each brand, which means we're not investing so much working capital, but we're also able to secure good terms with the suppliers because they're seeing a regular flow of business. It also gives us more flexibility to change that stock flow in line with demand as well.
Yeah. And what do you feel are the competencies that you as Heroes have as a supply chain organization that mean that you are able to kind of turn on that better planning for those companies, or like turn on that better purchasing process?
Yeah, I think some of the capabilities internal. So I have specialists in my team who've got backgrounds from FMCG businesses in supply and demand planning. I have buyers who've got years of experience working with factories in Asia, working with international brands at procurement. Some of it also is external. So we have partners, and Flexport's a really key part of our supply chain in that sense. External partners who can give us the visibility and the control and the service to make sure that we're managing our supply and operations. And one of the decisions that we took earlier this year was to focus all of our global freight on Flexport, because we got the visibility, the traction that we needed to keep things moving, particularly given the many challenges that most of us are facing out there at the moment.
Course. Yeah, and I mean that sort of strikes me as something where perhaps you are only having to solve the problem once, right? You figure out how to get visibility into your freight, you solve that problem, and then it's a different question to asking 10 different individual operators to solve the same problem. That's one way. It's not just about the scale, but it's kind of almost scale of problem solving, right? You solve that problem once, you know how to do it, you can replicate it 10 times.
You put it better than I could have done, to be honest. It's exactly that. I like the idea of a consistent operating platform. I like everything to be done once well, and I like everything to be in the same place as best we can. So yeah, we have the same teams in countries of origin like China facing off. So we only have one point of contact there. We have a global account management structure which supports us. There are regional operations people who support us, but it is one entity working seamlessly together, and really importantly at the moment, one visibility platform that we can go to and see what's going on, and understand where our shipments are, where there are delays for the many reasons that are happening, that we've got visibility, can understand that. And that's super important in an e-commerce business, because, and particularly on Amazon as well, your ability to continue strong sales is often driven by availability. Well, that's kind of true in any bricks and mortar environment, but often in bricks and mortar, you can, particularly if you're in a selling environment, direct the customer to another product or alternative. It's much more difficult to do online because it's not assisted in the same way. And plus, because of the way the Amazon rankings work, if you go out of stock, you can lose rank very quickly, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of investment to get that back. So for us, knowing where the stock is, knowing if there are issues, and being able to then manipulate different levers to protect our rank is really critical.
Got it. So it's really like taking that question of availability that is obviously important to every retailer, but sort of supercharging it because it's your competitive advantage on Amazon, right? Is being the one with the stock at that right time for the customer to buy.
Sorry, exactly. Yeah, it's exactly that. And part of that challenge, particularly in the run into Q4, is your competitors might be short on stock. There's a huge opportunity if you've got stock and you've preserved what you've got. So yeah, it's a very live and dynamic thing. And it's something we talk about every day, often multiple times a day, about where we're at on availability.
And when you think about availability, typically most retailers talk about availability in terms of what they have right now in their warehouse, right? And that historically has always been the focus of what my stock holding is. And sometimes companies can lose visibility of sort of what's happening more upstream in the supply chain. You are obviously talking about availability of stock very, very frequently. It's an important measure for you. How do you think about whether it's availability or a similar metric in terms of not only what you've got right now, but what's coming in, what's at the suppliers? How far back do you go, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's kind of how far back we go in terms of the supply chain operation, but then how far forward we go in terms of time, basically. So we run at a top level a heat map, effectively by brand and by region. Looking at availability, and that our key availability metric is that stock in Amazon available to sell. So it's a warehouse metric in the sense it's Amazon's fulfillment centers, but it's very much a shop front metric in terms of can the customer buy. And that measurement takes every stage in the supply chain up to and including intention to buy before we've created a purchase order as well. So it integrates that entire flow of activity from intention to buy through to stock being available to give us a sense of where we're going to be at. And we then flex that according to shifts in lead time, port disruption in the US West Coast, so that we can understand where the risk is going to be and what options we've got to try and mitigate that.
Got it. Okay, no, that's very, very interesting. One of the things that I always run into working with lots of e-commerce companies is, customer data has always been one of the big proof points for e-commerce companies, right? They've been able to, much more so than brick and mortar retailers, use that customer data to direct pricing or merchandising on the front end. What also comes with that then is a similar expectation around the data they can get on the back end of the operation, right? So what do you think about in terms of KPIs or data points that you want to see at Heroes on the sort of back end supply chain? What are you sort of measuring there?
Yeah, there's a slightly silly answer is I want to be able to measure everything because it's a bit like a child being let loose in a toy shop. You want it all. Once you get over that initial excitement of all the richness of data, the metrics we look at are not that radically different to what we looked at 10 or 15 years ago. It's cargo ready date. Is it going to be ready on time? And is it going to be ready in full? Is it on the vessel and has it sailed on time? What's the ETA and arrival port? And then what's the estimated arrival in a CFS if it's LCL, or at my warehouse if it's going FCL. So the milestones haven't changed because I think it's one of the interesting challenges. It's a very digital world now, but those of us working in supply chain, it's still a very analog world as well. We're still moving things. Yeah. We're moving boxes. The milestone visibility for me is more, once upon a time, I might have got a weekly update of all of that, which would be a batch load and would have to do some interpretation on. Now it's real time. Your colleagues recently moved an air freight shipment for us from Australia for one of our brands. And it's very cool to be able to go click on a link on Plane Finder or Flight Radar 24 and go, that's got our product on. It's currently over Fiji and it's going to land in LA in 11 hours. Yeah. But actually it's really cool. Everyone goes, oh, wow, that's amazing. But it's actually also really reassuring because, it's going to land in LA in 11 hours. Yeah. And, it's going to take 7 days to get out of the airport. It'll be in the warehouse on day 8. So actually we can increase our marketing activity and start driving volume on this because we know that we've got more stock on the way. So those kind of metrics, that kind of visibility is just really, really super useful for us in that very dynamic, being able to make a decision and see the impact almost immediately online.
Makes sense. So it's not so much about wanting to get access to different data than what you were doing before, because you're right, the fundamentals of the supply chain haven't changed, but in this kind of very competitive Amazon dynamic selling environment that you're living in, you just need it more up to the minute, right? So you can make faster decisions and do things like switch to an air freight shipment instead of an ocean shipment if you need to get something in faster. And as you said, then direct the marketing activity, like the kind of the feedback loop between what the supply chain can do and what you can sell, just so much shorter if you have that data at your fingertips.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think the feedback loop is a really good way of describing it. And it is that ability to action, consequence, follow-up action, right, can be near instantaneous now in terms of what's going on. Whereas, I'm unfortunately quite old now, and I remember the days basically when you used to fax information on a Monday to give people visibility of what's going on. That would be, you get a download of a week. So that means there's another week where things can happen and you don't know what's happened and you don't have that ability to respond. So it's just that much more dynamic. That can be a challenge as well, because sometimes things can happen, you react and then something else happens. And maybe if you'd waited a week, that would have all smoothed itself out. But by and large, it's a huge bonus.
You can always overreact to having the real-time information, right?
Indeed. You hit the panic button and realize maybe that was probably not the right reaction. You should have just waited instead. Right.
The thing that you touch on with the fax machine story is interesting. And I suppose it's similar to talking about data, but maybe slightly different. Is the other thing I see is that e-commerce companies tend to be very early adopters of technology across the board, right? And that's similar in the supply chain space, where they kind of tend to pick up supply chain technologies much earlier. At Heroes, how do you think about your kind of technology suite vision for the sort of back end? Like, how are you going about structuring that today and kind of planning for the future?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating area. And we are largely complete rolling out an ERP that will give us a really robust kind of financial stock inventory backbone for the business. And we've recently recruited a VP of engineering who comes from a really strong kind of Amazon seller background, and he's architecting a lot of that now. So the solutions probably aren't clear, but what we absolutely do want is something, and I always get shouted at for using this phrase, but something that's almost like a plug and play architecture, so we can easily integrate a new marketplace. Let's say hypothetically we decide we're going to go and expand in Mongolia, which is the example I always use. I can plug a Mongolian warehouse in really, really quickly. And similarly, that we've got the visibility from our freight partner that can go into that can give us the milestones, the data that we need to be able to run all of that. It starts to, if you're in an Amazon only world and you're purely selling through FBA, it's not too complex. The moment you start to proliferate marketplaces, your own direct to customer fulfillment, it starts to get massively more complex. And we're looking at kind of interconnectors, and I still call them middleware because it's the old-fashioned term for it. But the bits that sit in the middle between the applications and the ERP to join all of that up. And actually, some of it we'll probably want to try and do in-house. Some of it will be packaged, but we may well want to develop our own where we've got specific or bespoke requirements too. Yeah,
makes sense. I guess in that decision making of develop your own versus buy something off the shelf that you're going to use. There's also the angle of what do you require from partners, right? Because they can, your logistics partners, like for example, if you go to Mongolia and look for a warehouse partner there, you're probably going to want someone who has WMS that works in the right way, that can show you the stock, that can talk to you what you're doing. How, with that technology vision that you've got, how do you think about assessing partners, whether they're freight forwarders or warehouses, warehouse partners, or?
Yeah, it's a real challenge because the nature of our business, we're typically acquiring from people who don't have a supply chain background, so who probably have no idea what a WMS is, right, or certainly no idea what good looks like in a WMS. So we acquire what could be politely described, and I'm British, so I like to try and be polite about these things, as a varied assortment of warehousing partners.
Right.
A number of whom don't have WMSs. So there is a whole piece around strategic partner, of which Flexport absolutely is one for us from a freight perspective, and we have a number from a warehousing perspective. And then we have a long tail of what I would almost describe as kind of legacy partners who we've acquired, who we will in time migrate away from. There isn't always the flexibility to do that because they may specialize in a particular product type and it's difficult to get that service. But you're absolutely right. The minimum standard for me in terms of integration would be real-time or near real-time visibility of all of the milestones that I need to define. And if we get to the point where we're doing significant volumes of our own direct-to-consumer visibility, that has to be real-time SKU, location level visibility in a warehouse. For freight, it's a little bit less dynamic, but at the very least, you're expecting a daily refresh of every milestone that you can see, and real time where you can access it from your partner infrastructures, whether it's the particular terminal in Shanghai or the particular trucking operator in California.
So really, that's the vision for those strategic partners, right? When you're thinking about those strategic partners, you're building out a global operation with strategic partners that can plug into this system, provide the data, provide the milestones. You want those to be real time. That's kind of where you're going with it.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think it's the minimum standard for any service provider now to be able to do that in the world. Or anyone to have any scale and to be credible is you absolutely have to have that. It's the price of entry, basically.
let's wind the clock back a little on this. You mentioned that you have been doing logistics for a long time, and obviously with that bring a wealth of experience. In your prior roles, you've also worked at companies where the dominant model was brick and mortar.
Yeah.
Right. And now you're somewhere where the dominant model, well, the only model is online. How have you seen the approach to supply chain in companies change from when you were working in that brick and mortar dominant world to this e-commerce dominant world? How has that transition happened from the kind of supply chain organization perspective?
Yeah, I mean, if I parachute back 24 years to when I started out, you ran, as a fashion retailer, you ran 2 main seasons a year. You might have a couple of phases within those seasons, primarily driven by climate. Your supply chain was about moving large volumes of stock as economically as possible and delivering them largely in bulk to stores. So it was a bulk supply chain. There was mail order and there was catalog ordering, but they were very, very small parts of anybody's business, really. Online started out, I can remember being on the same floor as the Marks and Spencer e-commerce team when they went live with their first website in the year, I think it was 1999. I think it was 2 people working on it. And you see the evolution of this, and you see the existing bricks and mortar retailers having to cope with this tremendous amount of change in their organization and repurpose a supply chain that was designed to move big dollops of stock efficiently to dealing with what's now become a very granular supply chain. And that's been about, in terms of the final mile visibility to customer, because you're now not delivering to, say, 300 stores, delivering to 10 million customers a year. So you've got so much more to manage, so much more to have visibility of. And then upstream from that, it's also been about where you have the stock, and how do you leverage that stock. So having and I think this is an increasing emerging trend now in e-commerce, is about almost this hyper-localization of e-commerce. You have people doing 10-minute grocery delivery now in London and a number of other major European cities as well. You could never have done that from that conventional model of one national distribution center or a handful of regional distribution centers. So how we think about stock, where stock is placed and located, has just completely changed over that period of time. And more so in fashion than some of the products that Heroes sells. The expectation of speed, of turn, has got harder and harder, faster and faster. So you have the fast fashion operators who expect to go from concept to product in 4 weeks and keep doing that every week. And it's just the speed, the feedback loop that we talked about before has just changed so much. It's so incredibly, incredibly different.
Do you think it's changed the priorities for supply chain organizations? Like, you're very much describing a world in the brick and mortar that is a kind of push model, right? Like you said, like, you need to move all this stock, you move it on seasons, you do it in bulk, you want to do that efficiently in bulk. Then you're describing a world, this is a bit more of a now, which is very much a pull model, right? And that's kind of what's led, you want to be as close as possible to that demand as you can, as short a lead time as you can. Obviously efficiency is important, but you want to be as close to that customer as you can. In order to facilitate that change, do you think the priorities of supply chain organizations have changed, or do you think we're not there yet, or you think some people are doing it well and others haven't kind of really made that change?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, supply chain's caught a little bit between 2 conflicting things now. So it has this extremely dynamic demand environment that's dealing with. But as I said before, we still have effectively an analog movement of goods. Yeah. We haven't invented the teleport yet.
Right. Yeah.
Although I hope we don't, because none of us will have a job if the teleport exists. And production is still fundamentally hasn't changed. We haven't... The revolution of information technology, of the internet, hasn't really radically changed production. It's still, to make things, you still have to injection mold plastic or cut fabric. You still have to assemble stuff. So the supply chains had to adapt to take all of these inputs, this kind of pull model, as you say, but then translate that into a back end and upstream, which is still much more traditional. So and I think this is reflecting the fact that supply chains become a much more prevalent conversation in a boardroom with investors. Is it's now much more pivotal to the success of this business, whereas before it was they do trucks and warehouses. and things will just pretty much happen. And so long as they don't mess up their cost per unit and give us a profits warning, it'll all be all right. Now if supply chain goes wrong, we literally don't have a business, and it's all kind of fallen apart. So the prominence and the visibility and what we need to manage, it just becomes so much more important.
And that, I guess, is because the success of the supply chain is kind of directly linked to what we'll be able to sell now, right?
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
what's fundamentally changed, rather than the guys in the corner that tell us how much all of this ended up costing.
Yeah, precisely.
And in terms of how you think, I mean, just to talk specifically about freight forwarding, in that world that shifted from the push to pull, what do you think has changed in terms of what you require from a freight forwarder, right? Like if you were writing your wish list of this is what I need from the freight forwarder in that push world, and you're writing your list now of what I need for the freight forwarder in this pull world, what do you think has changed there?
If we talk about what we need now, I think visibility is the most important one, because as we touched on before, that's pivotal to delivering that availability and the way that we require. Execution is obviously then super important and becomes ever more important because you're running tighter cycles, stuff is more critical, you're making trading decisions based on all of that. So you need to have visibility of what's going on and confidence against the execution. I think there's a really important piece around expertise. So we've all seen supply chains globalize massively in the last 20 years. And there's a continuing thirst for international growth, new markets. So being able to leverage a forwarder's understanding and specialist skills around things like duty, around tax, around even just the basics of freight operations in new markets. How do I get this to market? How could I source from here? All of that stuff is really, really important. And you want to have the confidence that you can outsource that execution to a point as well. That you can let your local Flexport team origin liaise directly with the suppliers and arrange stuff without you having to get involved as the principal, or liaise downstream with warehousing or Amazon to deliver stuff in. So you want to have that confidence around the whole package is there and in place. These guys know what they're doing. They execute well. They can show us what's going on so that you can trust them to get on and run that. Whereas I think in the past, forwarders were box movers. You beat them up for price every 6 months and hope they didn't scrap your customs paperwork. Pretty much.
Right. Yeah, and I guess it sounds like what you're saying is a lot of that is driven by the speed at which you want to move, right? Yeah. Like maybe in the past, the kind of rollout of a new market would have been a relatively slow process. It would have been, well thought through internally. Now you're kind of almost talking about a world where you want to switch these things on. And if you're going to switch these things on, you're going to need to use the expertise of the people that you're working with, because you're just not going to be able to build that up so quickly. If you're operating in the UK and you want to operate in Mongolia, that's probably not something you want to do by building up your own Mongolian team, right? You want to rely on the partners to be able to switch you on there.
Exactly, and I think we're not at the moment massively over-focused on geographical growth, but that time will absolutely come for us. But we totally see that, and we see other opportunities come along in markets that we already trade in. And because it's online, because it's digital, okay, we can be trading by Friday.
Right.
Wow, okay, how do I then execute about the aspiration to be live on this in 2 days? I'm exaggerating slightly for effect, but that's the kind of pace that these things move at. It's a timeline that's measured in days and weeks, and we'll trial it and see how it goes, rather than, as you say, an 18-month-long project that has monthly board updates to update, because you're building this physical infrastructure, you're building a team, and you're building all of these things. It's just so much more dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I don't think we're going to be able to get away with the discussion today without touching a bit on current market and what's going on. I think it's been too disruptive a year to sort of totally ignore it, even though that's not really the topic. So I thought, we could just end by bringing it up to date and just talking a little bit about, like, it's been a disruptive year, massive supply chain disruptions everywhere. How have you been dealing with it? What do you think you've done that has helped you to get through it? And as you look forward now to Black Friday and Christmas, as we see supply chain stories hitting the news every day now, doesn't look like it's going to get easier. How well positioned are you for that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, it's been apologies for the language, it's been a hell of a year. I think everyone who works in supply chain probably needs a big hug because it's been a bit brutal in parts. How are we responding? It's interesting because I've talked a lot about efficiency and being very slick and lean. I think one of the things we've also learned from the last 18 months is that sometimes a little bit of fat in terms of stock, or a little bit of extra cost in terms of a faster mode of shipment, whether that's a premium service or sea air or air freight, makes a lot of sense now. We started planning way back in quarter two, not long after I joined the business and started putting that together. We built against extended lead times because we were apprehensive about where we could see the market going, and that was shaped and informed by the intel that we get from the Flexport team. It's still really hard. I think it's the US in particular is at the point of starting to create sleepless nights for us, just because, and as you say, it's extremely well publicized. The challenges in LA and Long Beach are absolutely slowing us down, and even against our massively extended lead times, we're being impacted by much bigger forces. Equally, from a UK and a Europe perspective, the decisions that we've made leave us feeling really confident about where we are going into peak, that the stock's going to be there and we're going to be well set up to trade. And that we're going to have a good season. Obviously, how online goes this year will be partly dependent on how the COVID situation evolves worldwide. If we see a rollback to lockdowns, e-commerce is going to see another rocket ship period of growth. If we get through the winter without that, it's probably going to be a less quiet time. But a lot of those e-commerce trends that are in play now are sticky and are here to stay. So we're still feeling pretty confident about where we are. The US, well, I mean, gosh, yeah. What a challenging situation for anyone who's bringing product in there. But there isn't really anything that man nor beast, nor even your chief exec on Twitter can fix the problem overnight. Yeah. Although I do respect the way that he tackled that one head on.
Yeah, though I do think he's had a pretty good go at it.
To get some action that quickly from elected politicians is no mean achievement.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. All right. Well, thanks, Kieran. I think I'll let you get back to that challenge of getting your stock together for the peak season. Thanks so much for discussion. It was very interesting. I think I've certainly gained a lot of insight from this on kind of the details of how you manage your operation, and you've given us a good insight on how that's really different to how the brick and mortar retailers worked. So great for that. Thank you very much. And see you again soon.